Hey, Steve Harvey here for the Illinois Broadcasters Association. And in a recent survey, the Illinois Emergency Management Agency was asked to name the top 5 items that every Illinois family needs to have in their home's emergency disaster kit. Check out these answers. Water, can't live without it. Number 2, non-perishable food. Well, after all, a man gotta eat, right? Number 3, weather radio, and make sure you got fresh batteries too. Number 4, flashlight, even more reason to have fresh batteries on hand. Number 5, first aid kit. Look, there's no reason to feud over what items to put in your family's emergency disaster kit. Get the answers and more at ready.illinois.gov. That's ready.illinois.gov.
Sponsored by the Illinois Emergency Management Agency, aired in cooperation with the Illinois Broadcasters Association and this station.
Separating families. I'm Rich Dennison, Fox News. President Trump plans to continue his administration's zero-tolerance policy of arresting undocumented immigrants and separating them from their children. Democrats say the president is using children as leverage to get funding for his border wall, since there's no law requiring families be separated.
In a tweet, he puts the onus on Democrats, writing, Democrats can fix their forced family breakup at the border by working with Republicans on new legislation for a change. This the day after he stunned Republican leadership with a declaration on Fox and Friends that he would not support a compromise immigration plan months in the making. Though the White House press staff went on defense and immediately clarified those remarks, insisting the president will sign onto one of the 2 Republican-led bills, frustration is still rampant on Capitol Hill.
Fox's Jillian Turner. President Trump plans to talk to lawmakers on Capitol Hill Tuesday to discuss immigration reform. The Department of Homeland Security reports nearly 2,000 children are being held by the U.S. government as part of that zero-tolerance border policy. Officials say that averages out to about 47 kids a day. 2 Wyandotte County, Kansas sheriff's deputies were shot and killed by an inmate they were transporting to a hearing in a Kansas City, Kansas Friday.
This all happened while the sheriff's deputies were transferring the inmate from the courthouse back to jail. Investigators say somehow the deputies were overcome by the inmate, and they believe the inmate possibly grabbed one of the deputies' guns and started firing. The sheriff's department says, to the best of its knowledge, the shooting happened in a secure gated area, and that suspect was handcuffed. Both deputies were transported to a nearby hospital, but their injuries were too severe. Investigators say the suspect was also shot during the incident, but right now is stable.
Fox's Jeff Paul. At least 17 people killed in Caracas, Venezuela in a stampede as officials tried to break up a large fight in a nightclub. Fox News. Fair and balanced.
Counts.
It has the attention of the world soccer fans at the moment, but the State Department warns Americans to reconsider travel plans to Russia.
The State Department putting out a warning late Friday saying there's a travel advisory for Russia and that U.S. citizens should reconsider travel there due to terrorism and harassment. State says terrorist groups continue plotting possible attacks in Russia, and although security for the World Cup will be extensive, the agency is warning terrorists target event locations such as stadiums and fan-fest viewing areas. They're also cautioning Americans to avoid high-risk areas like Chechnya and Crimea. And the advisory also says Americans in Russia are often subject to extortion by law enforcement and other officials. Jill Nato, Fox News.
2 Mexican citizens were among 8 people injured today in Moscow when a taxi crashed into pedestrians on a sidewalk near Red Square. Investigators say the driver says the crash was not intentional. With tensions easing with North Korea, some wonder if that nation could become a surfer's paradise.
As he met with North Korean leader Kim Jong-un this week, President Trump talked up what he called North Korea's great beaches.
He's right. There's a lot of potential.
Italian surfer Nick Zanella has led 3 surfing tours to North Korea.
It looks something in between East Coast Italy in wintertime and Northern California.
He describes clear blue skies, mountains, pine trees and crystal clear blue water. And he says he doesn't feel guilty handing cash to the regime.
I'm convinced that surfing is something that makes people feel free.
Simon Owen, Fox News.
A Kansas mother whose 5-year-old son accidentally knocked over a statue says she's gotten a $132,000 bill from an insurance company. Officials say the sculpture was on loan, so they were required to file an insurance claim. I'm Rich Dennison, Fox News Radio.
There are a ton of social networking websites, but one stands apart for a very special reason. This one saves lives. It's MatchingDonors.com. MatchingDonors.com links organ donors with people in need of kidney and other transplants. In the U.S., 19 people die each day waiting for an organ transplant, most of them for kidneys. If you've ever considered becoming a living organ donor, or if you have someone in need of an organ transplant, visit MatchingDonors.com. Home of the greatest gift of all, the gift of life. MatchingDonors.com.
From CBC News, The World This Hour, I'm Kaz Boivin. Authorities in British Columbia are still searching for 3 fishermen who went missing after their boat capsized near Tofino. Stephanie Skandaris has more.
We've now heard from the Joint Rescue Coordination Center in Victoria. They spent 18 hours doing an extensive search on land, air, and water for these 3 men. The Joint Rescue Coordination Center, or the JRCC, they have now called off their search. They've handed it over to the RCMP. The RCMP is now treating this as a missing persons case. Now, the JRCC says it thanks volunteers in kayaks and other small private vessels and people on the ground from the communities in the area, and they say their thoughts are with the loved ones of the missing. But we're also hearing that dozens of those volunteers have not given up their search, that throughout today, volunteers from neighboring communities, including 3 First Nations, all came out to help with more than a dozen boats.
CBC's Stephanie Skandaris. Houthi rebel forces in Yemen are resisting a Saudi-led coalition's efforts to take an important coastal city. Armored vehicles fire on Iranian-backed Houthis in the port city of Hodeidah. It's an offensive that Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates are hoping will dislodge the rebels, clearing the way for their Yemeni allies. UN officials warn the clash will cut off aid to millions of civilians at risk of starvation. The port city of Hodeidah is one of the only harbors in Yemen not cut off by a Saudi naval blockade. Spain and France have agreed to accept some of the 600 migrants turned away by Italy and Malta. The ships are expected to arrive shortly in Valencia. Arturo Valoro de Arona from the Spanish Red Cross says many passengers need urgent care.
We expect people extremely tired, maybe with some burns on their skins, with a lot of problems to walk after so many days in the sea.
Protesters marched in Rome today against Italy's new anti-immigration government after it denied entry to the migrants. Colombians go to the polls tomorrow to elect a new leader. As John Otis tells us, the choice is between a supporter of the country's peace deal with the FARC rebels and one of its main opponents.
The election pits Gustavo Petro, a former mayor of Bogotá and an ex-guerrilla fighter, against conservative Iván Duque. The 41-year-old Duque served just 1 term in the Colombian Senate. All of the polls indicate he will easily defeat Petro in tomorrow's vote. We are going to make changes, Duque says. We are going to guarantee truth, justice, and reparations. But it's not just Duque's message that has made him the frontrunner. Many Colombians say they're afraid of Petro. Before serving as a senator and mayor of Bogotá, Petro belonged to a now defunct guerrilla group. The 58-year-old was also close to the late Hugo Chavez, who ushered in the socialist revolution in Venezuela. That country is now suffering from food shortages and hyperinflation. Whoever wins will be sworn in for a 4-year term on August 7th. John Otis, CBC News, Bogotá.
Ontario's labour movement is preparing for the Progressive Conservatives' majority government, which could mean a scaled-back minimum wage. Supporters of a $15 rate gathered in Toronto. CBC's Philip Lee Shannock was there.
In Ontario, the minimum wage had been $11.60 an hour. Last January, the Liberal government bumped it up by more than $2. But the province wasn't going to stop there. They'd planned another increase to $15 an hour next January. Hundreds marched through the streets of Toronto today to demand that the new Progressive Conservative government stick to that plan. But businesses aren't so sure they can afford it. Ontario already has the highest minimum wage in the country. Chris Buckley is the president of the Ontario Federation of Labour. He says the march today is to demand that Premier-designate Doug Ford commit to raising the minimum wage as planned. Instead, the Ontario PCs had promised tax relief for low-wage earners, paid for through efficiencies. Philip Lee Shannock, CBC News, Toronto.
That is The World This Hour. From CBC News, I'm Kaz Boivin.
Live from NPR News in Washington, I'm Janine Herbst. President Trump plans to nominate Kathy Kraninger to lead the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. NPR's Shannon Van Zandt has more.
Kraninger is a deputy to Mick Mulvaney, the director of the Office of Management and Budget. He is also currently acting as the director of the CFPB, which he regularly criticized while in Congress. The White House calls Kraninger a staunch supporter of free enterprise. Consumer advocates expect her to continue Mulvaney's deregulatory agenda. The White House says the Bureau has been plagued by excessive spending and politicized agendas. The Obama administration established the CFPB to protect consumers from predatory lenders and other financial risk. Shannon Van Sant, NPR News, Washington.
Italy and France want to set up asylum centers in countries such as Libya, where migrants routinely set sail for Europe. The agreement follows a disagreement between the two countries after Italy refused to allow a rescue vessel to dock. Christopher Livesay has more.
French President Emmanuel Macron and Italian Prime Minister Giuseppe Conte have proposed building migration centers in countries like Libya. They said many migrants attempt to make the journey from North African countries only to die trying after months in squalid conditions. The agreement follows angry words between the two countries after Italy refused to allow more than 600 migrants to dock in its ports. Macron called Italy's decision cynical. In turn, Italy accused France of hypocrisy, arguing that Italy was on the front line of the migrant crisis with little to no help from the EU. The migrants were rerouted to Spain with an escort from the Italian Coast Guard. The showdown was an early sign of strength from Italy's new populist government, which is pushing an Italy-first social and migration policy. For NPR News, I'm Christopher Livesay in Rome.
In Venezuela, authorities are investigating a nightclub brawl and stampede that left at least 17 people dead. Officials say a tear gas device exploded during a fight, leading people to rush for the exits. Reports say several people have been arrested, including the club owner. Michigan is the first state in the country to set a goal of eliminating lead water lines. Michigan Public Radio's Rick Pluto reports it's the state's latest response to the Flint drinking water crisis.
Michigan Governor Rick Snyder says if the federal lead standard wasn't so confusing, the Flint water crisis might have been averted. The federal rule has not been revisited in 27 years, but there's little argument that lead water lines should go. Michigan's new rule affects about 2,000 local water systems. There could be as many as 10 million lead water lines servicing homes, schools, and businesses across the country.
Rick Pluto reporting. Tropical storm Carlotta has strengthened. The National Hurricane Center says the storm has maximum sustained winds of 60 miles an hour. The third named storm of the Pacific hurricane season is expected to make landfall tonight or early tomorrow on Mexico's coast. You're listening to NPR News from Washington. At Thomas Jefferson's estate in Charlottesville, Virginia, Sally Hemings, the enslaved woman who may have had 6 children with the former president, finally has an exhibit at his mountaintop home, Monticello. Hawes Spencer from member station WCVE has more.
20 years ago, DNA testing amplified what historians had long suspected, that Hemings and Jefferson had a long-term relationship. But how to commemorate it? Monticello historian Nia Bates.
We didn't have any recollections from Sally Hemings, and we didn't have any writings from Thomas Jefferson about the nature of their relationship.
What they did have was a memoir left by her son Madison.
So what we've been able to do is use Madison Hemings' words from 1873 and narrate a space about his mother.
Hemings won freedom for all 4 of her children and lived out her final years with 2 of them at a house in town. For NPR News, I'm Hawes Spencer in Charlottesville.
American Airlines will pay $45 million, settling a lawsuit that claims it and other major U.S. airlines colluded to drive up the cost of airfares, limiting capacity in order to increase ticket prices. Passengers said as demand for flights was flat and the cost of jet fuel was dropping, buying tickets was getting more expensive. Now, American has denied any wrongdoing, but it said fighting the case in court would be costly. The Texas-based airline is the second to settle. Earlier this year, Southwest Airlines also reached a settlement in the case, agreeing to pay $15 million. That airline also denies any wrongdoing. The suit continues against United and Delta. I'm Janine Herbst, and you're listening to NPR News in Washington.
The Peter Schiff Show.
Well, the big market-moving central bank announcement this week was not the Fed.
They came out with their so-called hawkish hike. I went over that on Wednesday's podcast. But yesterday, the ECB came out and, they were supposed to announce an end of their quantitative easing program, their own version of the taper, which they did. But they surprised the markets by indicating that they would not raise rates above zero, where they're stuck, until the summer of 2019. And the markets had not expected such a delay in rate hikes, so it was kind of a dovish tightening announced by the ECB. Now, when the Fed raised rates, the reaction was pretty much what I expected. The dollar did not strengthen, gold did not go down, because all of that had been priced into the market. What caused the dollar to rally and gold to sell off was the ECB and their unexpected ease, which put a bid into the dollar. We got a huge rise in the dollar yesterday. We got, like a 2% or so drop in the value of the euro against the dollar. And the weakness in the euro and the therefore strength in the dollar caused a lot of the emerging market currencies to sell off as well. So it was a huge dollar rally, not because the Fed hiked, but because the ECB effectively eased. And, initially, yesterday, gold jumped 2% in euro terms. In fact, it jumped up to the high end of the range that it had been trading against the euro, and it was very close to a breakout against the euro. It was only up a couple of bunks against the dollar, so all of the rise was in terms of euros, and of course other currencies that also fell against the dollar. But this morning, the traders came out huge. I guess when we couldn't get above that key level in terms of the euro, there was massive selling of gold this morning right out of the gate, and gold finally dropped about $20. We actually broke down below. Remember on Wednesday, I talked about the fact that gold had been in a $12 range all month, and I knew that that wasn't going to persist, that gold was going to have to break out one way or the other. My guess was that it was going to break to the upside because I expected that gold would rise after the Fed hiked rates, which is what it had been doing pretty much after every rate hike. But I think what I didn't expect was the ECB to come out with an effective ease, and that's what caused gold to break out of that range. So I was right about the breakout, but I guessed wrong as far as which way we would go because we ended up down. We were down about $23 today. Gold closed just below $12.80. And so now either we're going to continue to break down near $12.50 or maybe this is a little bit of a head fake. And normally sometimes before a market goes in one direction, it'll head fake the other direction to stop some people out. It's hard to say, but I do think that what the ECB just did in the very short run could cause a little bit more buying in the dollar. But of course, the markets are wrong if they think the ECB is really going to wait over a year before raising interest rates. I do not believe that that is going to happen. I still believe that the ECB is actually going to be hiking rates probably around the time that the Fed starts cutting them. So this whole idea that America is going to keep tightening while the rest of the world is easing is wrong. And still, everybody is under the impression that the global economy is slowing down with the exception of the United States, right? The United States is this island of growth in a sea of weakness. And I think they've got it backwards. And that is ultimately what's causing all the opportunities in the market. But one of the reasons that I believe that the ECB is going to be tightening far sooner than the markets expect is look at what's happening at inflation in the Eurozone. You know, when Draghi gave his press conference following their announcement, when he talked about the fact that they were not going to raise rates until summer of 2019, the rationale was because they wanted to make sure that inflation was meeting their objective. And their objective is to have inflation close to but less than 2%, right? That's their policy goal. Now, of course, the original policy goal of the ECB was just to have inflation less than 2%. This close to, but less than 2%, is something that Draghi introduced, because kind of made it up in order to justify this reckless monetary policy. Because if inflation is just 1%, the ECB should not try to move it up to 1.9. I mean, 1% is better than 1.9. The whole original idea was 2% was the ceiling. And so as long as you were below the ceiling, great. And the more below it you were, the better. But in order to justify all this money printing and all this QE and whatever they were doing to prop up all these bloated governments, they came up with the idea that we need to be as close to 2% as possible without going over, kind of like the Price is Right. Well, we got the Eurozone CPI numbers out today for May. Year over year, CPI in the Eurozone up 1.9%. Now, how much closer to 2% can you get without going over than 1.9? They're not satisfied with that. What is Draghi going for? 1.99, right? We need to create more inflation because we're only at 1.9. We're not quite close enough to 2%. First of all, what makes them think that they can fine-tune it that much, that they can get to within 0.1%? And then, of course, if they get to 1.99, maybe they want 1.999, right? How ridiculous are they going to take this, as if the numbers are even that accurate to begin with? But if you have to stay below 2%, why would you want to risk getting that close? Because what happens if we get to 2.1? Do they got to start slamming on the brake? Do they got to start tightening? If you got to stay below 2%, you would think you'd want to have a little bit of a buffer between where you are and 2%. You wouldn't want to get this close. But look at what's going on in Germany. Germany, year over year, CPI up 2.2%. So Germany is higher than 2% by more than the Eurozone in general is below 2%. But look at producer prices in Germany, up 2.9% year over year. Now, that's a leading indicator of where consumer prices are going, because wholesale prices go up, and then businesses pass on those higher costs to the consumer. So if wholesale prices are rising by 2.9%, what direction does that tell you that consumer prices are going? They're going up. And if Draghi is saying we're going to keep the pedal to the metal, we're going to keep interest rates at zero for another year, and inflation is already accelerating. It's past 2% in Germany. Clearly, it's going to pass 2% in the rest of the Eurozone. Where is it going to be a year from now? 2.5% in the Eurozone, 3% in Germany, maybe more. Is the Bundesbank going to sit back with inflation running out of control and just allow the ECB to keep interest rates at zero based on the fact that their goal is to get inflation close to 2% when it's already above 2%? So I think everybody just assuming that the ECB is going to leave rates at zero for all this time, I think they're wrong. Now, maybe they'll try to get away with it. Maybe they'll try to rationalize having it above 2%, but they're not talking about that now. They're not talking about symmetry like the Fed is doing. They still are sticking to their rhetoric that we need to be below 2%. I missed this in the press conference from Wednesday with Powell, but he was talking about inflation and he made a Freudian slip. He said that we are going to make sure to keep inflation above 2%. And then he corrected himself and said, at 2%. But even though he went back and corrected himself, I think that was a Freudian slip, because he knows the goal is to keep inflation above 2%, or not even a goal. He knows inflation is going to be above 2%, so he might as well pretend that's his goal, because that's what's going to happen. So at least he can claim that he's getting success. But the ECB, they cannot have inflation above 2%. Now, maybe they're going to say, well, it's the core that we want to have below, because the core is still a little bit below 1.9. I forget, maybe 1.7 on the core. But they have to keep headline inflation below 2%. I don't think Germany, the Bundesbank, is going to allow the ECB to come out and say, oh, now we're switching up and now we just care about the core CPI and they don't care about headline. But because headline is what everybody buys. And, those are the prices that people actually pay. And I don't think they're going to allow, let's not count food, let's not count energy. The Bundesbank is a very staunch inflation-fighting bank, and they are able to give the ECB this leeway because, inflation was still below 2%. Of course, officially, I'm sure that their CPI is not accurate, just like ours. So if they're at 1.9% officially, I'm sure unofficially it's higher than that. But it's already higher than that in Germany. That's obviously pissing off the German bankers. And by the time Eurozone inflation gets to 2.1, 2.2, we'll probably be at 2.5 in Germany, maybe more. And so I think the markets have this wrong. But I also think they have it wrong to think that the Fed is going to be able to continue to tighten and that the U.S. economy is just going to be fine, that the U.S. markets are going to be fine. It's not. In fact, the inflation problem, too, it's not just in the Eurozone. I mean, we've got an inflation problem in the United States. In fact, yesterday we got the import prices that came out year over year up 4.3%. And this is before the new tariffs that are coming out. We got prices up 4.3%. Obviously, we have to buy those imports. That's why they're coming in. Those things are being driven by inflation. In fact, we got the retail sales numbers that also came out yesterday, most recent month, up 0.8%, which was much higher than everybody expected. And the initial reaction is, this is great news. But you have to remember that retail sales are not adjusted for inflation. They are just measuring the dollar price of what's sold. And I believe that jump is not because consumers bought more stuff. It's because they spent more money on the stuff that they bought because prices are going up. So if prices are going up, then retail sales are going up in dollar value. But it doesn't mean the volume is going up. It doesn't mean people are buying more things than they were buying before. So they don't have anything extra to show for the extra spending. They just bought the same stuff or maybe even less stuff. But whatever they buy, they paid higher prices for it. So I think this is evidencing inflation. I mean, inflation is going to break out all over the world. I mean, we've already created the inflation. It's all the money supply. It's all the QE. It's all this money printing and bond buying. That's the inflation. It's just that it's just starting to move from the financial assets, stocks, bonds, real estate, into consumer prices. But this is the beginning of a huge wave of inflation that's going to, engulf the entire planet. But I believe that Europe is going to be more likely to fight the inflation based on the influence of the Bundesbank than will the Federal Reserve based on the influence of Donald Trump trying to get reelected. I mean, there's going to be lots of political pressure on the Fed to prop everything up and not to fight inflation, to embrace the higher inflation. The Fed is already talking about that by allowing inflation to be over 2%. The Freudian slip just admitting that it's going to be over 2%. So we have no break on inflation. Plus, we're hopelessly in debt. We need inflation. We have these huge trade deficits. That's not the case with the Eurozone. They can more afford to have higher interest rates. Now, that is going to create some political problems in some of these countries like Italy, right? Greece, Spain. But that's something that they're going to have to deal with because I do not see Germany just basically saying we're going to be a high inflationary economy. They are not going to throw away all of their tradition of sound money. I mean, they threw away partially when they went into the euro, but I don't think they're going to abandon it completely. I think, they are more likely to try to fight inflation than the U.S., which will not, there's no chance we're going to fight it. We're going to embrace it. We're going to pretend it's good for us. If you remember back in the 1970s, right, when inflation really became a problem, right, for the first time. And a lot of it, again, was due to all the money we printed in the 1960s. But Gerald Ford, who came out with the whip inflation now, when he came out with that, he said inflation was public enemy number one, right? Well, who causes inflation? The government. The government prints the money. In fact, my father, the book that I've talked about, his book, The Biggest Con. Well, his original title for The Biggest Con was The U.S. Government, Public Enemy Number One. His publishers, Arlington House, changed it to The Biggest Con. But in the book, he mentions right in the beginning that was his initial idea for the title. But the reason that he wanted to call it U.S. government public enemy number one was because he knew the U.S. government, through the Federal Reserve, created all the inflation. And so if President Ford said inflation is public enemy number one, and the government is the creator of inflation, then it is the government that is, in fact, public enemy number one. And why is inflation public enemy number one? Because it robs the public of their wealth. It robs the public of their purchasing power. And that is exactly what is going to happen, right? Rather than governments defaulting on their debts, they are just going to inflate them away. So they're not going to take away your money. They're not going to rob you of your money. They are going to rob your money of its purchasing power. But the net effect is the same. The difference is how you plan for it, how you protect yourself. And of course, the government creates all this inflation, but they never accept responsibility for it. In fact, Donald Trump, again, just the other day, was out there blaming OPEC for rising oil prices, right? Well, if Trump thinks oil prices are rising now, although they were down quite a bit today, everything was down today except for the dollar and U.S. Treasuries. But if Trump thinks the price of oil is going up fast now, wait till he sees what happens once the Fed has to monetize the deficits that he's created by increasing government spending and cutting taxes. Because, back when Nixon was president and we had this big spike up in oil, of course, Nixon and everybody was blaming OPEC, saying, oh, you guys are jacking up the price of oil. But OPEC wasn't increasing the price of oil. The United States was debasing the value of the dollar. We went off the gold standard, 1971, and we started paying OPEC for oil in dollars that were collapsing in value. And so it wasn't that OPEC was raising the oil price. They were simply adjusting the oil price for the fall in the value of the dollar, because we were asking OPEC to sell us oil, the same oil, for dollars that had less value. Well, when OPEC sells us their oil, they got to turn around and buy stuff with the money, but the price of all the stuff was going up because we were debasing our money. So it wasn't OPEC's fault for raising prices. It was the U.S. government's fault for debasing the dollar that we were using to buy the oil. And the same thing's going to happen this time. It's not going to be OPEC or the greedy speculators or the companies that are trying to gouge the customers, right? The government always likes to create inflation and then blame the businesses, or blame the unions, That's why, Nixon had wage and price controls. The idea behind wage and price controls is that inflation is being caused by businesses raising their prices or by workers demanding higher wages. But the reason everybody is demanding more money, whether it's prices or wages, is because money is losing value. And so you need to earn more money to maintain your purchasing power. So the government puts the cart before the horse when they have wage and price controls. And of course, wage and price controls are not going to work because you're just putting a Band-Aid on a cancer. The cancer keeps getting worse because you keep printing money. And then businesses and workers find ways around wage and price controls. Like, well, don't give me a raise, just give me health insurance as part of my salary. That's how a lot of this stuff started. Or businesses start coming up with brand new products. Like a grocery store will come out with a different cut of steak that never existed before. And now it can put whatever price on it wants because it's not raising its prices. It's just got a brand new product. Everybody was finding ways to get around the wage and price controls. But eventually, of course, they got to get rid of them because they result in shortages. Right? You can't buy stuff. And then eventually when you take the wage and price controls off, then prices shoot up to catch up to where they need to be because the government kept printing money. And that is the direction that we're headed in. Everybody is still convinced that there's no inflation when the evidence is overwhelming. Inflation has been hiding in plain sight, right? It's been hiding in all these asset prices, but nobody cares. And then the government's, trumped up, no pun intended, economic numbers, which mask the true rate of inflation. Who knows how much higher than, what they officially admit. In the U.S. now, we're about, 2.2, 2.3 is our year-over-year CPI, and I said 1.9 in the Eurozone. But I'm sure on both sides of the Atlantic, inflation is actually running quite a bit hotter than the governments admit. which means GDP growth is much lower. In fact, Trump was on television today, again, fielding questions from the press, and he repeated the false statement that America today has the best economy in its history, in the history of the country, going back to the Constitution, right? So starting with George Washington to right now, the economy is better today than it was at any time in our history. Now, either Trump is just lying or his knowledge of American history is very limited. I mean, limited maybe to the last few years. He knows nothing about American history. In fact, if you knew anything about American history, you would know that the best economy we ever had was in a period that I think Mark Twain labeled as the Gilded Age. And I think that was approximately 1870, right? A little bit after the end of the Civil War. So 1870 to 1900, right? And during that period of time, we had massive economic growth. Now, they didn't even keep the GDP statistics back then, so I don't know if we know what the GDP was, but they have all sorts of other ways to measure, things, production, output, living standards, real wages, and we have never seen an economy like that. It was the biggest boom. I mean, and we were bringing in immigrants by the millions were coming in to our country, but during that period of time, the standard of living of the average guy rose like never before, probably in world history, not just U.S. history, in world history. And sure, it was the age of the robber baron. You had the Carnegies, the Rockefellers, right? These guys were getting rich, but everybody was benefiting. The poorest people, the middle class, there were huge fortunes that were being generated, and they were trickling down, right? And everybody benefited from all that capitalism. Because what we didn't have is an income tax. We didn't have Social Security. We didn't have a minimum wage. We didn't have all sorts of government. We had lots of freedom. We had minimal taxes. And we probably had the purest gold standard in the U.S. history. So we had sound money, we had limited government, and we had massive economic growth on a scale the world has never seen. Not just, absolute growth in America, but compared to the rest of the world. How fast America grew relative to any of the economies in Europe or anywhere in the world. We've never had a period of time where we outgrew the world as rapidly as we did back then. So Trump is not even close if he thinks we have the best economy in our history when it pales in comparison to the Gilded Age. But you don't even have to go back to the Gilded Age. We had a much better economy in the 1980s, in the 1990s. I mean, if you want to measure it just by GDP, which is probably what the Trump is looking at. So I don't know what he's talking about. I mean, last year we had 2.2% GDP growth. Now, if he thinks this year is so much better, we are running up massive amounts of debt in order to fuel what he thinks is a good economy. But it's living on borrowed money. The government didn't borrow any money during the Gilded Age. That was real economic growth. We weren't levering up. That was legitimate. Today, whatever growth we have is at the expense of a collapse tomorrow. We're borrowing all the money, right? Our GDP is growing much slower than our debt, right? So that's not real, right? But Trump keeps reiterating these lies, and everybody's still buying it. That's still the mentality out there, that everything is great in America, and the rest of the world is in trouble, and there's the demand for dollars. I mean, I mentioned before on another podcast how crazy it is that people think that the fact that we're going to have so much debt, that we're going to be selling $2 trillion worth of treasuries, that somehow that's going to make the dollar go up, because now everyone's going to have to buy dollars to load up on those treasuries. Why would anybody want those treasuries? That's probably the worst place you could put your money, but people are jumping to these erroneous conclusions. Bigger debts are bad for the dollar, because what they mean is the Fed is going to have to monetize those debts. There's no way that we're going to find buyers in the private sector for those bonds at rates that we can afford. It's going to have to be the Fed. People are delusional if they think the Fed is actually going to shrink its balance sheet. But right now, delusion is what's ruling the day. In fact, look at how everybody reacted today to the new trade war, right? Trump announced today new tariffs, $50 billion worth of tariffs on China. And the initial reaction is, this is good for the dollar. Why? Why is a trade war good for the dollar? Because people think, well, if we have tariffs, then America's trade deficit is going to go down, And therefore, that's going to be good for the dollar. Well, first of all, our trade deficit is enormous. It should be much worse for the dollar than it is. Even if the tariffs shrink the trade deficit, it's not going away. We're still going to have a huge trade deficit. But to the extent the trade deficit goes down because of the tariffs, it's because American consumption goes down. It's because we buy less stuff, because we can't produce the stuff ourselves. So if we're going to stop buying because of the tariffs, that means we just have less consumer spending, which is going to drag down the GDP. So this is not like some kind of big thing for the dollar if we have slightly less trade deficits. And of course, if our trade deficits come down, that means foreigners have fewer dollars that they need to recycle back into the bond market. So now they don't have to buy as many treasuries. Well, who's going to buy the treasuries? Everybody was bullish on the dollar because they thought everybody was going to be buying the treasuries. None of this stuff makes sense. In fact, a couple of days ago, I think on Wednesday, Dallas Fed President Dick Fisher was on television talking about tariffs and trade war. And he came out there again and repeated this conventional wisdom nonsense. And he said, well, we don't have to worry about a trade war because trade is a smaller part of our economy than in countries like Germany. And therefore, he said that, it's no big deal if, there's a drop in trade because it's not that important in America. And I would argue that trade is more important to the U.S. economy than any other country on the planet. And this is the reason. Yes, trade is a relatively small part of our overall GDP, but it's probably the most important part because we are importing all of the key things that everybody needs, right? And so if we can't import those products anymore, even though the actual product represents a smaller part of the GDP, if those products are no longer there, it's going to affect a much bigger part of the GDP, right? If Walmart doesn't have a bunch of products to sell, well, what happens to all the salaries of all the Walmart workers, right? If Walmart isn't selling as much stuff and it shuts down stores and it lays people off, the actual merchandise is a small part of what Walmart is contributing to GDP. Right? You take away all the products that people are buying, then all of the infrastructure that's been built around those products collapses. So to think that, well, just because the actual dollar value of the stuff is a small part of our overall GNP, you got to look at all the other stuff that is built on top of that. You take out the bottom and everything else collapses. But it's not just the stuff that we're buying. It's the fact that we don't have to pay for it. We get all this stuff for free, right? We just export dollars. Right? If we actually had to pay for the stuff, if we actually had to produce it, then we would feel the cost. Right now, we don't. We get to print all this money and we export it. We're exporting our inflation, right? That means we're not getting, punished as much. We're not feeling the pain of our monetary policy because we're sending that inflation abroad. We're exporting that pain. But you also have to look at the flip side. What happens to all those dollars, right, that we create out of thin air and send to other countries to buy all the stuff that they had to work hard to produce? They take that stuff, those dollars, and they buy our treasuries. They loan it right back to us. So that's keeping interest rates down. So our trade deficits, which are enormous and which are a big problem, and it's evidence of an even bigger problem, and we're basically, bankrupting the country. We're just selling off our assets and going into debt. But in the short run, it's great because we live beyond our means. But what's happening in the here and now is these trade deficits keep consumer prices low because we export money and import stuff. So that keeps the price of stuff down. But it's also keeping interest rates down because the money is then loaned right back to us. Now, sure, we have to pay it back, but so far we don't pay any of it back because foreigners keep rolling over the bonds every time they mature. So it's just one gigantic Ponzi scheme. But we're benefiting from that Ponzi scheme and that it's propping up our entire economy. So if the trade deficits went away, the U.S. economy would collapse because we'd have nothing to buy and interest rates would be sky high. So guys like, Dick Fisher still don't appreciate how much our current phony economy depends on the perpetuation of this relationship where we run huge trade deficits that the world recycles. Now, in the long run, this is terrible for us. But no one cares about the long run. All they care about is how to keep the scheme going, up until the next election. Which, brings me to the point that I don't know that they can do it until the next presidential election. I mean, right now, all they care about are the midterm elections coming up in November. They want to keep this whole thing going until then, which potentially is why the Fed may not raise interest rates twice this year. I mean, in November, the December one would be after the election. But if things start slipping between now and November, then there will be that pressure on the Fed to do something to help keep the music going, right? To help keep propping up the markets. But right now, nobody is thinking about that. Nobody is actually looking at the facts. They're just operating in this delusion. And, just like all of these delusions, eventually reality rears its head. And when it does, right, it is a huge market moving event because nobody is prepared for it, because nobody understands it. And we also got the industrial production numbers come out today. Not many people talking about it. I mean, we had the biggest drop in auto production in 5 years. I mean, the number came out negative, which was a surprise. But look at what's going on with the auto sector. I mean, I've been talking about the auto bubble for years. It's obvious now the air is coming out of it. And of course, people buy cars on credit. So as interest rates go up, I mean, a lot of these cars are becoming more expensive. But it's not just the auto market. Look at the housing market. Look at the home building stocks. They're all in bear markets, right? Despite the fact that the NASDAQ made a new high this week, right? You've got bear markets in the home builders. So you got autos slowing down and you got home building slowing down. Why is home building slowing down? Mortgage rates are going up. Houses are becoming more expensive, but the cost of building is going up. Raw material prices are rising. The cost of insuring a home. If you buy a house, you got to get insurance. Well, insurance rates are rising. Plus, these insurance companies have to make up for big losses that they had with natural disasters. But these tariffs that Trump is imposing on steel, you use a lot of steel when you're building a house. And if the price of steel goes up, well, then it costs more to build a house. So you've got the auto sector rolling over. You've got the housing sector rolling over. These are important sectors when it comes to employment. Right? A lot of jobs in construction, a lot of jobs associated with the auto industry. These are the higher paying jobs too. If these sectors are turning down, then what's going to happen to the economy? I mean, people could be operating, I said, in this delusion. They're heading for a cliff and they're ignoring all the road signs, that say danger ahead. They're just, nothing phases them until by the time they get to the cliff, they're too close to slow down and they end up going over the edge of it. And that's exactly where we're headed. We're headed for the edge of a cliff, and most of the people are going to go right over that cliff because they have no idea it's coming. But what I'm doing and what I'm, advising my clients to do is prepare for it. I understand what these signs mean. I know what's happening up ahead, right? I don't know exactly the path to get there, but I understand what the signs are telling me, and I know where we're headed. And to me, everything else is just noise. What I'm seeing in the real world, right? Despite what the government wants me to believe, what I can actually tell is happening is validating what I've been saying. And I know people want to say, oh, Peter, you've been saying this stuff for a long time. I have been, and I think that what I've been saying is correct. The fact that a lot of the problems haven't manifest in a crisis yet doesn't invalidate what I'm saying. The crisis is the end game, right? By the time we have a crisis, okay, well, right? It's too late to do anything about what I'm saying. The warnings don't mean anything after the fact. They only mean something beforehand. And there's no way to time it perfectly. It's impossible. So either you're early or you're late. And if you're late, well, then you're nowhere. You're done. So you got to be early. But the key is to recognize that even if you're early, that doesn't mean you're wrong. And you don't have to give in to the temptation of joining the party where the party is occupied by a bunch of people who have no idea how wrong they are, right? And they're in that bus heading over that cliff. They might be having a great time. There's a lot of drinks on the bus and everybody's singing and dancing and having a big party. They have no idea what's in store for them. I don't want to get on that bus because I know what's going to happen, right? And I want to be someplace nice and safe, and I'm going to ignore the temptations. But everything I'm seeing is we don't have much time. I said, I don't think we're going to make it through the end of Trump's term. I really don't. Does it mean that it's impossible? No. But I think the odds are that we're not going to get through. And so we don't have that much longer to wait. I mean, this is happening. This is it. This is now. You just have to stay off of the ride. We want to be in a safe haven. We want to, buy the dip in gold. We want to sell the rallies in the dollar. We want to get into the real safe havens. We want to get into the investments around the world that will benefit from a weak dollar, that will benefit from a reversal in Fed policy, and that will ultimately benefit from the dollar no longer being the world's reserve currency, because that is where we're headed. And when that happens, then our ride on the global gravy train comes to an end. But a lot of the people around the world who have been doing all the heavy lifting, who have been pulling that train, the people who have been producing and saving and investing, those areas of the world are going to experience a boom. Right now, they're being suppressed by this perverse system that is screwing up the glowing economy by having the dollar at the center when our economy is so dysfunctional. You can't have a reserve currency where the issuer is running massive trade deficits and has no domestic savings. I mean, it doesn't make any sense for the dollar to be the reserve currency. When the dollar was backed by gold, when America had massive trade surpluses, okay, it made sense. But that world no longer exists. America took advantage of that unique privilege and took the world on a buggy ride. And now the global economy is screwed up as a result of this system, which is now coming to an end, right? It's not over yet, but we are in the final stages of this global monetary system. I don't know exactly what's going to replace it, but my feeling is we're going to go back to the type of monetary system that existed before the U.S. dollar corrupted it.
With SRN News, I'm Ron DeRockstra. China today raised import duties on $34 billion worth of American goods in retaliation to President Trump's tariffs on Chinese products.
The list includes 545 U.S. products, including soybeans, electric cars, orange juice, whiskey, salmon, and cigars. China's Commerce Ministry says it's responding on an equal scale to the U.S. tariff hike announced Friday. Analyst Erland Eck says Washington's go-it-alone approach undercuts its leverage.
If the EU, Japan, and some other countries were to team up with the U.S. In a more sophisticated strategy, then I think they will be more alarmed.
And Eck says Beijing was prepared.
They have done their calculations, been preparing for years.
China says it's also scrapping agreements to narrow Beijing's multi-billion-dollar trade surplus with the U.S. Ben Thomas, Washington.
Also at srnnews.com, graduates of the U.S. Merchant Marine Academy heard from Defense Secretary James Mattis today, who told them to always maintain integrity and run the ethical midfield. Mattis also stressed preparedness and taking responsibility in Saturday's commencement address to the 191 graduates. Vitamin D may protect against colon cancer. Dr. Charles Snyderman tells us more.
Analysis of 17 international studies concludes that low blood levels of vitamin D increase the risk of colorectal cancer by about 20%. Blood levels even higher than that currently recommended to protect bones against fractures reduce the risk of colorectal cancer significantly more, but there are health risks associated with levels of vitamin D that are too high. Dietary recommendations for vitamin D are being reevaluated in light of this new data. This is Dr. Charles Snyderman reporting from Washington.
Big game in the World Cup tomorrow. It's Germany against Mexico. This is SRN News. A Christian legal group has filed suit against Ball State University.
Alliance Defending Freedom says the Indiana school blocked funding to a pro-life group because of its views. ADF says Ball State has, quote, applied a student activity fee policy in a way that unconstitutionally discriminates against the viewpoints of groups like Students for Life, while favoring other campus groups with ideological views that university officials favor. The suit has been filed in the U.S. District Court for the Southern District of Indiana. Michael Harrington, SRN News.
Retiring Utah Republican Senator Orrin Hatch expressed support for homosexual youth in a Senate speech this week, somewhat surprising for a man who's long been an opponent of same-sex marriage. Hatch spoke of suicide epidemic among LGBT teenagers and argued in favor of a proposal that would establish a national suicide prevention hotline. This is SRN News. A veteran of the Houston Police Department knew people desperately needed help, even though he needed help as well.
Officer Norbert Ramon decided to forego cancer treatments and get to work last August when Hurricane Harvey made landfall on the Texas coast and submerged Houston neighborhoods. He and other officers used police boats to rescue thousands, all while he battled stage 4 colon cancer. After nearly 25 years with the department, Houston PD confirms that Officer Ramon lost his battle with cancer on Friday. Val Dior reporting.
In January, the Houston Texans surprised Ramon with Super Bowl tickets. The big game was played at Houston's NRG Stadium. It was a thank you for his heroism months earlier. On this day in 1858, accepting the Illinois Republican Party nomination for U.S. Senate, Abraham Lincoln said that slavery issue had to be resolved, declaring, "A house divided against itself cannot stand." More at srnnews.com.
Your NBC Sports Radio update starts now.
Well, Zach Johnson, who is a two-time major winner, calls what's going on at Shinnecock Hills in the U.S. Open carnage, and it looks like he's right. 4 people tied for the lead, and they're all 3 over par after 3 rounds. Brooks Koepka, Dustin Johnson, Daniel Berger, and Tony Finau. I guess the good news is they're all Americans. Going into the last round tomorrow, over par is the leader. World Cup scoreboard: France 2, Australia 1, Argentina and Iceland, they draw at 1, Peru and Denmark, another draw 1-1, Croatia 2, Nigeria 0. And speaking of the carnage at the U.S. Open, here's Tiger Woods about being not happy with his performance.
I'm not very happy the way I played and the way I putted. I'm at 10 over par. I don't know if you can be too happy and too excited about 10 over par. You look at all those championships, I really played well at the right time. I may not have been playing well going in, but I played well at that particular week. And our whole careers are pretty much measured as if you can win 4 times a year. 1 year I did it 3 times.
Here's Tiger on the expectations.
I wanted to shoot something around 68, 67. I thought that would have been a great score. And I looked at it as kind of progressively putting myself back into position because I couldn't chase down the leaders right away. It's going to take me probably 2.5 to 3 rounds to do it. Unfortunately, I went the other way.
Baseball scoreboard: Mariners up 1-0 on the Red Sox mid-7, end of 5. Dodgers up over the Giants 3-1 mid-5th. It is Cubs and Cardinals tied at 3. Final scores from earlier: Yankees 4, Rays 1, Tigers 7, White Sox 5, Astros 10, Royals 2, Marlins 5-4 over the Orioles. It was the Angels losing to the Athletics 6-4. Rangers 5-2 over the Rockies. Pirates 6-2 over the Reds. Blue Jays shut out the Nationals 2-0. Twins 9-3 over the Indians. Phillies 4-1 over the Brewers. And it was the Braves shutting out the Padres 1-0. It's Dave Smith. It's NBC Sports Radio and NBCSportsRadio.com.
In an emergency, radio can be your lifeline. When the power is out and cellular networks are down, Next Radio is the free FM radio app that still works on your Android smartphone. Download Next Radio now at the Google Play Store. Stay tuned to this station and stay safe.
Hannah?
James?
BBC Minute.
Now, it might be called Everything Is Love, but Jay-Z and Beyonce are certainly in a combative mood on this new joint album they've released on Saturday.
Yep, one song sees Queen Bee taken on Spotify, and no, the album can't be streamed on there if you're wondering.
While another song has Jay dissing the NFL and the Grammys. Seems they've both got scores to settle.
Speaking of scores, let's get the latest from the World Cup. Simon's in Russia for us.
Hannah, look away now. Not a good night for Nigeria. They lost their opening game to Croatia 2-0. It means they're bottom of the group at the moment. It is only after 1 game, though, so a long way to go. Don't panic yet.
Now, remember the African migrants who've been caught up in a row between different European countries? Well, a port city in Spain is preparing to welcome 600 of them to the country.
And a mass naked photo shoot is now set to go ahead in Australia.
Hooray! A shop had said the artist would get in customers' way while snapping thousands of people in the nude, but it's now bowed to public pressure. It's going to let him do it.
0259G.
BBC Minute. This is Betty White. I know you don't need one more thing to worry about, but listen.
High blood pressure can cause kidney damage, blindness, heart attack, stroke, and you can have high blood pressure even if you feel all right. 1 in 7 adults has it, but it's easy to get your blood pressure checked, and you can treat it if it is too high. So don't worry about it, don't ignore it, just see your doctor and check it out.
For your free booklet, visit the Will Rogers Institute at wrinstitute.org and find us on Facebook and Twitter.
The Tom Woods Show, episode 1180.
Prepare to set fire to the index card of allowable opinion. Your daily dose of liberty education starts here. The Tom Woods Show.
Folks, if you enjoy reading my takedowns of the college crazies, I've got a whole collection of them for you. It's in my free ebook, Sane Space, Libertarian Dispatches from Bizarro America. Check it out at sanespacebook.com. Hi, everybody. Tom Woods here. Very glad to be joined once again by Guido Holzmann, who is a professor of economics at the University of Angers in France. He is widely published in terms of academic articles and articles for a popular audience. He is known probably most for his book, Mises, The Last Night of Liberalism, because it's such an extraordinary biography of Ludwig von Mises. And it's not just the details of his breakfast habits and things like that, but it really explores the intellectual significance. It's an intellectual history, to my mind, of Mises' various contributions. It situates those contributions in the context of debates happening at the time, and you emerge with a much, much deeper understanding of economics, the history of economic thought, and of Mises' role in all this. So that's a great, great contribution. But what we're going to be talking about today is a book that has been unjustly eclipsed by that one, and that is The Ethics of Money Production. And in particular, that book has a chapter on the cultural consequences of fiat money inflation. So I want to talk about that today. What are the consequences for society? The consequences for government, certainly, but also for the way society functions and the expectations that get built in that inform people's decision-making, let's say. These are some of the aspects of the question that tend to be neglected, and Guido treats them in a way that's very systematic and very convincing. So I'm very glad to welcome him back. Guido, welcome back to the show.
Thank you, Tom. It's wonderful to be again on your show.
Your biography of Mises is a tremendous achievement. Yet, I fear it means that people will know less about your work, The Ethics of Money Production, than they otherwise would, because they have this huge tome they can read, but they're overlooking such a great work of yours, so important, that has helped me to understand both money and monetary policy, but also the ethical questions involved better than anything I've ever read. I can say that without fear of contradiction.
So thank you very much.
I would like you to first explain the origins of this book, because then when people read it, I think it'll be easier for them to understand why it takes the particular approach that it does.
The book was initially commissioned by the Acton Institute. They had a series on various aspects of the market economy, which they wanted to be analyzed from a Christian or Catholic point of view. So I was writing this manuscript, and then, as many of my products, it turned out to be much bigger than it was initially planned. So rather than having 80 pages, it was then 280 pages. So then it became too big for them, and they said they wanted to cut it. And I did not agree. I mean, we didn't have a contract or something like this. I didn't have a formal engagement. It was just the idea that I should, as somebody who was working in this field, write up a short monograph of the sort. So I was not contractually bound by the Institute. I said, well, I mean, you may publish it as it, or if you do not wish it, well, I will not cut it to 80 pages, because then I would also have lost the copyrights to the rest of the manuscript. So I decided to publish it with somebody else, and this somebody else turned out to be the Mises Institute. So they had no qualms about publishing the whole manuscript. And that's how it was published in 2008. The book itself was originally written in 2003, 2004, and then I was busy with finishing the Mises biography. So it took a while to get it finally out, but then 2008 it was on the market.
Chapter 13 of this book is has an economic dimension, no doubt, but really brings home what all this means for the average person in a way that not a lot of other material does. And I actually recently listened to a presentation you gave on this topic in which you said that very few scholars seem really to have investigated the question of the cultural and, as you say, spiritual legacy of fiat inflation, not to mention the political consequences of it. I'd like to start with a definition, maybe two definitions, fiat money and inflation, and then we'll go from there.
Fiat money is money imposed on the economy by the state. So that's the general definition, right? Fiat money, we associate it typically with an immaterial type of money, so banknotes, accounting money, and so on, which would be the narrow definition of a fiat money. There are very good reasons why this represents the very essence of fiat money. But in a large sense, any money that the government imposes on the economy is fiat money. So if the government imposes on the money a silver standard or a gold standard, then that too would be fiat money in the large sense, right? Because it's not freely chosen by the market participants, but enforced on them by government power. Now, immaterial or dematerialized forms of money, so paper, notes, accounting money, tokens out of unprecious metal, are particularly interesting because they can be multiplied ad libitum. So that is without any limitations by the government. And of course, what the government wishes to do is to use money to fill its own treasure chest, right? So that's the whole point of having such a money, that it allows the government to gain access to additional sources of funding that it would not otherwise have. Now, culture can be defined in the large sense, and that's how I use the term, as the manner in which we do things that we do. So it's the how we do things. It connotes the standards and the values that prompt us to go about things in one way rather than in another. Right. So, I mean, we can sleep in various ways. We can sleep like the Japanese on futons. We can sleep like people in the Caribbeans and so on in hammocks. Or we can sleep in our nice American and European beds and so on. So these are different ways of performing the same thing. We can eat in different ways. We can talk in different ways. French people have a very different way of leading a discussion than Germans or Americans. Right? All of this reflects our culture. Now, the culture, of course, does not exist in a vacuum, right? If you just look at any given situation, you are born into a culture. It's just so many ways how you do things. It's just there. It doesn't seem to be the fruit of any act of volition. But ultimately, of course, culture has a history, so it's a current state of a trajectory that reaches far back into the past, and has resulted from choices. And these choices always have an economic aspect, which is why economists have the word to say about the origin of culture and especially the modifications of culture. And this is what brought me to talk about the subject in my money book, because definitely the way the monetary system is organized has an impact on how we do, speak, and think about things. And so this is the subject of this chapter 13.
All right. I want to ask you something, though, before we go on, just to settle a bit of not quite a bet, but an argument I have going with Bob Murphy. We were talking about Bitcoin and discussing whether Bitcoin is fiat money. And I said no, because because it's not, quote, backed by something, unquote, that's not what makes something fiat money. If people voluntarily choose to transact in it and there's no coercion involved, then I don't think it is fiat money. So who's right about this?
Well, it always depends on the definition. But in the light
No, it doesn't.
Yeah, it does.
Yeah, of course it does. I know.
Yeah.
Just tell me Murphy's wrong. That's what I want to hear.
Yeah. So in the light of the definition that I just gave you, then Bitcoin is not a fiat money. Right. So clearly, I guess, Bob, he uses a different definition of fiat money, probably inspired by the translation of Mises' money book. Right. So in the theory of money and credit, the German term Zeichengeld is translated as fiat money, which is not fully accurate. Right? Zeichengeld means literally it's a sign money, right? So it's a dematerialized money. So dematerialized money can be a free market money, as in the case of Bitcoin, but it can also be a fiat money, as in the case of all other government-sponsored paper monies and so on.
All right. Well, I know it obviously depends on definitions, but which do you think is the correct definition?
Well, I think the definition that I've just given you is the most useful one. Therefore, I use it.
Okay, so therefore Murphy's wrong. Let's move on to the next.
Yes, but by the way, I do not think that Bitcoin is money. Right? It's misleading. I do not. I think that presently it is money.
Okay, but it
is
can
an
be
economic
used as a
good.
medium of exchange.
Yeah, it is an economic good,
and it can be used as a medium of exchange. And insofar as it is used as a medium of exchange, it's not fiat.
Exactly.
That's my point.
Yeah. I agree.
Okay, so all right, that's great. That's so glorious. All right, so now that we've trashed Bob Murphy, let's carry on with the actual subject. Let me run through your chapter and hit on some of the points you raised. Now, some of these points will not always seem like cultural questions. They may have to do with political culture and the way people think about and form their expectations about political institutions. But there are some other factors that you discussed that are cultural, and according to any definition. But you say, for example, that fiat inflation encourages centralized governments. And then in turn, you note that this runs counter to the way an orderly society ought to be arranged. So how is that?
Well, governments, like any organizations, right, they labor under the principle of increasing costs, right, increasing marginal costs. So the larger is the organization, the larger are the efforts that you need to make, or the costs that are entailed just by keeping the whole thing together, right? If you have a very large organization, well, then costs are much higher than if you have a small organization. And these costs pertain just to the inner organization, so the inner coordination of all the members of this thing. If you have in a market economy, well, size is determined by, well, costs on the one hand, but also revenue on the other hand, right? So if revenue is sufficiently high, then a large organization is workable. And this is why we have, for example, very large car companies, and why we have the large energy producers and so on. Now, in the case of governments, of course, this way of analyzing the question is not fully appropriate, because governments are not operating in a free market, right? So they're imposing themselves. But the problem of cost remains, right? So if you have a larger organization, then ceteris paribus, it's less efficient than a smaller organization. Now, if governments can gain access to additional funding, such as it comes out of the printing press, then they gain a competitive advantage over other governments that do not share this privilege. And since money production is typically organized on the national level, so it's the central government that produces the money of the economy, this government then becomes larger relative to the regional and local governments than it could otherwise have been. And this is indeed what we observe empirically in the Western world throughout the past 200 years in particular, right? So we had precious metal standards until the 20th century, until the early 20th century, certainly. And until then, we had a very different balance between central government, regional governments, local governments than we have today. Just think of the case of the United States, right? The federal government was extremely small around the year 1900. And one of the reasons was that they didn't have a printing press. As soon as they have set up the central bank, of course, what does it do? It buys federal bonds, right? It buys government bonds. So it doesn't buy bonds of the different states. It buys a bond of the federal state. So this increases the resources of the central apparatus, and thereby makes that it grows relative to the other ones. Now, the other ones are growing as well, right? I mean, so the government grows in general, but within the government, you get the recomposition, a rebalancing of the different branches of it.
All right, I want to move on to, even though you cover things like war and the way inflation helps to finance war and other questions like this, let's get to some things where we see how inflation influences the behavior of ordinary people. We see how it encourages the behavior of governments, but let's see how it now seeps into society. And let's begin with business. You have a section on the business person under fiat inflation. How is the way he looks at business, looks at money, looks at the world affected by living under an inflationary fiat regime?
The most important mechanism that here comes into play is it goes by the excessive role that credit comes to play in a fiat monetary regime. So maybe I should first explain this mechanism. Right? If you have a fiat money system, then of course it already depends on the question, how is the money created? Now, in the bank-based systems that we had in the West, fiat money was, or is still created in the way of bank credit, right? So if let's say you have a printing press, Tom, right? So you can you're producing banknotes. Now these banknotes can be brought into circulation, and they can be brought under the control of the government in different ways. One very simple way would simply be to print it and then just fill a truck with the freshly printed banknotes and send them over to the Ministry of Finance, right? So the Treasury Department. And that's actually how it was very often done in the past. The French revolutionaries, when they set up their assignats, they had precisely such a setup, right? So they produced the banknotes called assignats, and they were directly at the disposition of the Ministry of Finance, which then went on to spend it as they thought fit. And therefore, some people also think that as soon as you have a fiat money system in place, you really don't need taxation anymore, because the government can simply print all the money that it would ever need. Now, this is, for various reasons, is not how we go about this today. The way we bring money under the control of the government, and we bring it into circulation, is via credit. Now, this is very interesting. The main motivation that brought this about is not some sinister plot by the government to get people into debt, but quite to the contrary, it was a concern of the classical liberals in the 19th century who many of whom resisted the introduction of central banks, but they say, well, we have to limit this incredible power that comes with such a centralized banking institution. And then also with the creation of fiat money, we have to limit this somehow. And the limitation that they came up with was a limitation, as they thought, by the market, namely that the central bank should have the right to create money, but only in the way of credit. That is, the limitation that comes into play is that the central bank cannot unilaterally create new money. It needs at least one partner. It needs somebody who wants to go into debt. Now, of course, that can be the government itself, right? Or it can be in the private sector. So if companies or private households want to go into more debt, then, well, you are allowed to hand out or to create more money, right? That was the initial idea. So we have a monetary system that is based on the principle of creation of money via credit, right? And this per se already increases the level of indebtedness of the economy. So if you have a monetary system such as ours, by definition, you might say, there's much more debt in this economy than you would otherwise have. But then comes into play a second factor, and the second factor is even more powerful. And it has sprung into full force in the 20th century. And this factor works through the tendency of money creation to entail positive price inflation rates. This was not the case in the 19th century. So in the 19th century, we had a fiat monetary system, right? Government money was imposed on the economy and so on. But the money creation and credit expansion was kept within such limits that there was no permanent positive price inflation rate. Right? So the money supply was increased, but not increased sufficiently strong so as to increase a permanent rise of the price level. Right? So by and large, the money supply was increased at about the same rhythm as there was an increase of aggregate production, so as you had economic growth. Now, in the 20th century, this changes. And if you look at monetary statistics, it's a very, very clear-cut separation. And the crucial year in which there's really a change is 1946. So the first post-war peace year. 1946 was the first post-war peace year in Western history in which prices continued to increase. In all previous periods, war times had always been times when the price level increased because the governments used the printing press to finance war-related expenditure. But then as soon as you had peace, this use of the printing press stopped, and as a consequence, prices started to decline. Right? So you had a price deflationary environment as a natural environment of the market economy in the US, in Britain, in Western Europe, all throughout the 19th century, and until World War II, during peace times. Now, after World War II, for the first time in human history, we had a permanent increase of the price level because governments continued during peacetime the very same monetary policies that before were only used in war times, namely expansionary monetary policy. Now, all of this, of course, was on the rhetorical, theoretical level, was justified by the new Keynesian economics. But this is, something that is not really of much interest for us here. For us, what is interesting is, so we have this new situation in which the price level increases permanently, foreseeably so. Now, in such a situation, there is a very strong incentive for people to go into debt. And this incentive holds true for all sectors of the economy. It holds true for governments, so for the public sector. It holds true for companies. And it holds true for private households. Think of the situation of a private household, which is probably most familiar to people listening to this show. Most young people, when they get out of school, so they graduate from a university and so on, they get a job. First thing they do is they take out a credit if they have, they already have another one to finance their studies. But so they get out of school, and then rather than paying back their credit only and then accumulating equity capital, they take out another loan in order to buy a house. Why is this so? Well, because at the beginning, when you take out the credit, then the debt service represents a relatively high share of your income. But in the course of time, in a price inflationary environment, all prices go up. That is, your revenue will also go up. Now, if you take out a fixed interest loan, then the amount of money that you have to pay back each month stays the same, but your revenue increases. Therefore, you have a strong incentive to go into debt now, and as much as possible into debt now, in order to enrich yourself, right, through this price inflationary process. So this is what all households do. And firms act in exactly the same way, and for still other reasons that we might discuss later. And governments do the same thing, right? A government goes very heavily into debt in a price inflationary environment because it can expect tax revenue to increase in the future. So therefore, the debt burden will grow ever lighter because of the price inflationary process, right? So in a fiat money system that produces constant price inflation rates, you get necessarily a debt economy. And this is what we see in the figures, right? After World War II, the tendency was very, very clear-cut, right? All sectors of the economy get ever more into debt. Now, of course, a debt economy, a debt-laden economy, has very different cultural features than an economy based on equity that is not debt-ridden. Right? Think, for example, of the fact that people in a debt economy, they are, of course, always dependent on the banker. They are dependent that other people will give them more money. Some people think this is a good thing, and certainly to some extent it increases, right, the social bonds that exist between different strata of the population. But it certainly creates dependency and despondency to an extent that we didn't have in the 19th century. It creates not only material dependence, but therefore also intellectual dependence, emotional, mental dependence, right? You're no longer your own man. Then think of a company that is heavily indebted, it will make also its business decisions in a different way than a company that operates just with its own money. A debt-ridden company will try to avoid the risks that a debt-free company might take. A debt-free company, for example, does not necessarily need to have revenue every quarter, right? Does not need to show results immediately. So it can forego profits for a few years and then engage in activities that will bring about important fruit only 5 or 7 years down the road. If you're heavily indebted, this is out of the question. You need to satisfy your creditors, and you need to reassure your creditors by showing constant revenue. So this precludes from the outset that you engage in this and that activity. You need to focus on activities that bring in constant revenue. So that, right? It's not necessarily this is good or bad from a moral point of view, but it's very different as compared to what we would have in a debt-free economy.
One of the points I've made for years is a point that I now realize I imbibed from your book without remembering. So I've been presenting it not necessarily as my own creation, but without citing anybody. And that is that under a regime like this, even when inflation, when we think of it as price inflation, is relatively low as it is today, well, even relatively low price inflation accumulated over a number of years amounts to a pretty substantial erosion of your purchasing power.
Exactly.
Even in this situation, you have real consequences for the average person, and that has to do with how the average person saves for the future. Because in the old days, under precious metal system, when the precious metals were circulated as money, then those precious metals maintained or even increased their purchasing power over time. So you needed to do nothing other than simply accumulate them. But today you'd be a moron to just accumulate Federal Reserve notes. They're going to lose a huge chunk of their value by the time you retire.
Right.
So instead it means you have to spend your time engaged in speculation, which in turn means you're doing things you're not trained to do, which means you're even more worried about money than you would otherwise be.
Yes.
You're preoccupied with money to a degree you would not be otherwise. A very good point.
Yes.
Yeah. So I appreciate you because in particular, the point about being preoccupied with money when we're accused as free market people of being people who think about nothing other than money. But in fact, it's the more you get away from the market system, the more people are obsessed with money. Of course, in socialist societies, when people are poor, you're obsessed with every scrap you can get so that you can stay alive in reasonable dignity. It's only when you reach a level of wealth where your basic needs are met that you can afford to think about non-monetary goods.
Exactly. Yeah. And I know a few people who are more materialistic than people who are working actually for governments, right? Very often there's an excessive attention to the material aspects. There's also much envy, right? Is this guy has reached a pay class higher than mine, earlier than myself, and so on and so on, right? So it's true, right? So things like greed, avarice, envy and so on are certainly not particular features of a market economy. And as you have said, there are very good reasons to argue that actually if you have a purely free economy in which the market is free to operate, such excesses, such moral excesses and vices like greed and avarice actually tend to be contained to a larger extent than in our current situation in which we have monetary interventionism, which spurs, encourages, remunerates such vices rather than refrain them.
And then you say in your book that people will tend to prolong the phase of their lives in which they strive to earn money, and they will place relatively greater emphasis on monetary returns than on any other criterion in choosing their profession.
Yeah.
For example, some of those who would rather be inclined to gardening will nevertheless seek industrial employment if the latter offers greater long-run monetary returns, and so on. So that's also very interesting.
Yeah. It's a necessary consequence of the debt economy, right? So if you are in debt, it's just like for a firm about which I talked to you before, right? It's ultimately it's the same mechanism. You have to make sure that the money is on the table when you have to pay back or have to serve your loan. So therefore, this colors all of your life choices.
Indeed. Now, before we proceed, there is one economic question I want to ask, just as long as we're on the subject. When you were talking about, I was saying that you could just accumulate money and just that could be your nest egg for your retirement. You don't have to worry that it's going to lose purchasing power. So in order to maintain that, I need to invest it in stocks and bonds or whatever. But so one argument that people have made against this is to say, well, if you can get an adequate return from just sitting on the cash, then a lot of people will just sit on the cash instead of investing it. So you're not going to get the kind of growth that we would have in a fiat system where the inflation nudges them into having to invest it.
Yeah. Now, this is an important argument. It's wrong, right? And it's very important to understand why it's wrong. The hoarding of money, right, has of course been denounced since time immemorial, and it's really at the bottom of this argument. It was the basic premise of the whole of Keynes' philosophy, economic philosophy, right? That the true motor of economic development is the spending of money. So if you're just sitting on your money or hoarding money, this might be good for yourself, but it's a sterile form of saving that does not benefit the rest of the economy. Now, this is wrong because the hoarding of money has very different social implications than the hoarding of any other good. In the case of any other good, if you're, let's say, you're a farmer and you have sheep, and if you just like to look at your sheep and pet them and whatever, so you're never selling them on the market, but actually you are really the only person who will benefit from them. Right? You're the only person to have them. All our people are deprived of this. And the same thing holds true for all other resources, right? If you keep other things just for yourself rather than using them in a productive process, rather than selling them to other people, well, it's just really just for you, and others are deprived of it. In the case of money, that's not the case. And the reason is that the hoarding of money has an impact on the price level, and therefore on the purchasing power of all other money units that are being used. If a significant part of the population increases its cash hoards, right? So people, rather than spending their dollars, they're just keeping them, let's say, under the mattress, under the proverbial mattress. So there would be less dollars in circulation. As a consequence, the price level would tend to drop. Right? If there's less money in circulation, money becomes more scarce relative to all other goods. So therefore, less money will be exchanged against all those other goods. Prices will diminish. As the price level diminishes, the purchasing power of all other money units that are still being used increases. So these other people can, in exchange for their money, obtain more goods and services than they could before, thanks to the hoarding of those others. So you see, if you're hoarding money, you cannot avoid providing additional purchasing power to other people. It's almost as though you had given them a credit, except that there is no credit, right? The mechanism is different, but the result is the same, right? Or at least it's very similar. If I can hand over a credit to another person, then he profits from the fact that I've saved. Now he can spend the money. If I hoard money, well, then other people's purchasing power increases. So it's as though I had given them a part of my money to spend. Now, the big difference between the two cases is that in the case of credit, of course, what we do is to hand over our savings in a concentrated form to this person rather than to another one. So he can really our savings have a significant impact on this and that other market participant. Whereas if we hoard, it has a very minor, small impact on a great number of people, right? On all other market participants. So the positive impact is diluted and is often barely perceptible. But the principle remains, right? The hoarding of money is not something that would just benefit the saver himself. It's necessarily something that benefits other people. And so we see that, since you brought up the example, the great importance of precious metals-based monetary system is that precisely it encourages savings rather than consumptive expenditure. And as a consequence, other people benefit from this savings, right? The economy as a whole benefits from these savings without debt, right? It's very different. So it's a much healthier way of bringing savings to the benefit of the rest of the economy than in our current debt-based monetary system.
You have a section toward the end of this chapter on the welfare state, which you say would not really have been able to reach the size that it has in the absence of inflation.
Yeah.
So I'd like to, first of all, hear if you can justify that statement. And then secondly, let's talk about what the consequences for society of that have been. We're just trying to create a safety net for the most vulnerable people, is what your critics would say.
Well, I mean, of course, the welfare state increases for the general reason that we have already discussed, right? As a consequence of this additional source of funding that comes with fiat money, the state, especially the central state that is the privileged partner of the monetary authorities, grows larger than all other sectors of the economy, grows larger than the other branches of government, but also than the private sector. Now, the government, therefore, can spend more money on its own agenda. Now, this agenda might be a European-style welfare state, or it might be an American-style warfare state, right? So both the warfare state increases and the welfare state increases. In the US, you're catching up on the welfare segment, right? So you're not lagging behind the Europeans as much as you were in the 70s and the 80s. And of course, if you spend more money on welfare, then you produce the typical results that come with the welfare state. Now, these results are very different from the ones that are usually professed by the champions of the welfare state. So for them, the welfare state is just an instance, it's just an organization of social solidarity among the members of society. But of course, this is a misrepresentation because solidarity is based on true concern for what other people are doing, for the needs of other people, sensitivity to the needs of. So you are interested in what others are doing, and you're interested because it's your own money that is at stake, right? If I have a poor neighbor and he needs my assistance, well, then, of course, I need to be interested because so he asked for my assistance. Well, of course, I don't want to waste my money. So, first of all, I really want to know something about his situation, to understand what his problem is, what are his prospects, before I make such an engagement. And my continued engagement is based on such continued, understanding of his own situation, and it also creates some sort of a friendship, right? Friendship between the benefactor and the donee. In a welfare state, that's very different because in a welfare state, the assistance that people obtain is an enforceable legal claim on the state, or if you wish, on the community. Now, this already from the outset produces the very opposite of solidarity. It produces avarice, irresponsibility on both sides, right? Benefactor and donee. The benefactor is no longer concerned because he cannot avoid, he cannot help funding these other guys. But so since he can avoid it, it's not his decision to make. So he grows indifferent vis-a-vis these other people, and the benefactors themselves, they become irresponsible because they have a legally enforceable claim, so they do not have to make any adjustments to their behavior, which some of them can make, and which they would make if they depended on voluntary contributions from neighbors, friends, associates, and so on. So you get something very different. You don't get increased national solidarity. You get a world of irresponsibility and indifference. Right? These are the main consequences of the welfare state. So social relations do not flourish, but become they're not warm. Right? They become cold and indifferent. Very different from what we had in the 19th century.
Let me close with this. Your chapter uses the word cultural in the name. So when we look over these different ways, and you have others we haven't gotten to in your chapter, that fiat inflation affects the way people behave, the way people look at the world, the values they hold, all the sorts of, a lot of things that go to make up what a person really is all about. How do they also apply to areas of life that we would more properly refer to as culture?
Oh, you mean like the performing arts and painters and so on? You mean this?
Is there anything there?
Oh, yeah, definitely. I think, for example, today, of course, the the government is a large purchaser, right, of artwork, right? Especially if you think of theater, opera, and so on. Very often this is state run. Painters and so on, right? So the government is the largest purchaser in the market. And of course, this colors the type of works that are being produced. And many artists are very sensible to this, and they abhor of the consequences, right? You have to deal with bureaucrats who often have a very completely ideological approach to art, right? So they want to put into practice, implement in practice certain abstract conceptions that they have about what art is and should be. So one of the main driving forces of what art is and always has been from the mist of times, namely beauty, gets relegated to a completely secondary place, right? So, as we always say, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Well, I do not completely agree with this, but, right. So in any case, if you have a bureaucratic organization that purchases art and that commissions works of art, considerations of beauty become completely secondary. What becomes primordial is whether it pleases the patrons, which are also the higher up in the bureaucratic echelons, and maybe the average consumer, right? So the average voter. But aesthetic value and beauty becomes completely secondary. And this is why we see so much ugly sculptures, so many ugly sculptures, so many ugly paintings, such horrible architecture all over the place. I think it's a consequence of the fact that government is massively involved in the art business.
Wow, there's so much to say, it turns out, about inflation that isn't what you'll find in a typical textbook.
Yes.
It spills over into civil society in ways that most people miss, and even professional economists have little to say about or are maybe even unaware of. So you're a pioneer, Guido Hulsmann.
Thank you very much, sir.
Very important work. So, of course, people should read. Now, that's just one chapter, by the way.
Yes.
What we've talked about is one portion of one chapter of the ethics of money production. By the time you get done with this thing, you're going to be a lethal weapon in the world of ideas. I'll put it that way. So you should read it. I'm going to link to it at tomwoods.com/1180. That's 1180. You can read it online for free. You can buy a hard copy, which is what I have because I can't read things online. It makes me crazy. But either way, you'll want to read this and you will feel like you're the king of the world because you'll have knowledge that even the economists don't have. And that's a nice position to be in. Guido, thanks so much for your time.
My pleasure, Tom.
All right, folks, remember, free and open to the public is a tremendous event going on June 30th, 2018 in New Orleans. Scott Horton will be there, as will Michael Bolden, Dave Smith, Jordan Page, Eric July with Backwards, Murray Sabrin, a whole bunch of people you've heard on this show are all going to be there, and it's going to be a tremendous time supporting the Mises Caucus. So check that out at takehumanaction.com, and I hope to see you there. I also hope to see you aboard the Contra Cruise. Check it out at contracruise.com. The best libertarian week of the year. Well, certainly the best libertarian week on water, but I would say arguably of the whole year. It's a tremendous time. Come basically take your vacation with me and with a whole bunch of other folks you are going to become lifelong friends with. Check out the details at contracruise.com, and I'll see you next week.
Become a smarter libertarian in just 30 minutes a day. Visit tomwoods.com to subscribe to the show for free, and we'll see you next time.
All right. Well, thank you, Guido. I'll see you next month. And thank you, Clay, for doing this.
Yeah. Hey, Tom, by the way, last month I met, did I tell you this? There comes a student, walks into my office at Grove City College, and he said he had listened to our show, the last show on the Tom Woods show. And he said, he must admire all people who are in the Tom Woods show. It's one of his highest aims in life to make it to the Tom Woods show. I said, wow. Okay. So just, you got to, something out of this. Yeah, so
here you were thinking it was receiving academic awards or being in scholarly societies. Turns out that's all been in vain.
Yeah.
What you really needed was this.
Well, I'm glad that I've jumped this barrier already.
That's great to hear. I wish we had said that on the air. That's funny. Okay, all right. I'll see you later. Thanks a lot.
Bye-bye, Tom.
Okay, goodbye.
There are a ton of social networking websites, but one stands apart for a very special reason. This one saves lives. It's MatchingDonors.com. MatchingDonors.com links organ donors with people in need of kidney and other transplants. In the U.S., 22 people die each day waiting for an organ transplant, most of them for kidneys. If you've ever considered becoming a living organ donor, or if you're someone in need of an organ transplant, visit MatchingDonors.com, home of the greatest gift of all, the gift of life. MatchingDonors.com.
Radio. It's nothing new. It's been here all along, with free entertainment, news, sports, music, and information. It's not just part of life, it's part of who we are. You know which station is going to tell you the score of the game, which one's going to give you a laugh in the morning, which one is going to give you something to sing along with. You know where to turn when the weather gets rough. When something big happens, good or bad, you know where to go because radio has been here all along. Radio is part of your community, woven into the fabric of what makes home, home. And now, radio has evolved to move with you with the Next Radio app and your FM-enabled phone. Just plug in your headphones to start experiencing radio in a whole new way while using way less battery and data than streaming apps. Check out the live guide to see and interact with live radio stations. Easily find your favorites like the one you're listening to right now. And as always, it's totally free. Download the Next Radio app today. Next Radio. Live and local wherever you go.
Get to Old Navy today for $1 flip-flops with your Old Navy card, plus 50% off all shorts and swimwear at Old Navy and OldNavy.com. Valid 6/16 to 6/17. Excludes in-store clearance, active shorts, licensed shorts, and licensed swimwear. Flip-flop limit 10 select styles.
Oh, man, I'm retired. I don't have the time. I have tea times. Not time to read the Inspector General's report. That's up to Jamie 2.0, and he'll be talking about it a lot. I did cherry pick some things, though. Hey, maybe the reason James Comey wasn't really interested in prosecuting Hillary Clinton for the things she did with her private email account is because he was conducting official business on a private email account. Maybe one of the things I enjoyed most about the IG report was all of these statements from FBI agents about no way we're ever going to allow Donald Trump to be president of the United States. Wait a minute. FBI agents talking about what they are and are not going to allow to happen in the political arena through the vote? And then there's one FBI employee. Here's the quote. Trump supporters are all poor to middle class, uneducated lady POS that think he will magically grant them jobs for doing nothing. They probably don't watch the debates, aren't fully educated on his policies, and are stupidly wrapped up in his unmerited enthusiasm. Wait a minute. Jobs for doing nothing? That's a Democrat policy. It's not an abbreviation for positive. It's actually the letters that follow the words Chuck Schumer. Oh, the agent lamented about the end of the Affordable Care Act. But after all of this was disclosed, the IG says there was no hint of political bias. And James Comey didn't know that Anthony Weiner was married to Huma Abedin? How's that for keeping track? And then there's the taint word. But I'm not going there. Never have, never will. Solomon Brothers Studios, Naples. This is Neil Bortz.
Get to Old Navy today for $1 flip-flops with your Old Navy card, plus 50% off all shorts and swimwear at Old Navy and OldNavy.com. Valid 6/16 to 6/17. Excludes in-store clearance, active shorts, licensed shorts, and licensed swimwear. Flip-flop limit 10 select styles.
This is the Cato Daily Podcast for Tuesday, June 12th, 2018. I'm Caleb Brown. Florida's rules governing who can sell hearing aids are antiquated and preempted by federal law, according to Larry Salzman of the Pacific Legal Foundation. We talked about PLF's new case challenging Florida's onerous rules this weekend.
One of Pacific Legal Foundation's newest cases involves Dan Taylor. Dan is our client in Florida. He lives in southern Florida, and he's been a hearing aid specialist for 30 years. And what that means is he has a license from the government to sell hearing aids. Over the years, he's found that the license is unnecessary, burdensome, increases the cost of hearing aids. And that's because in Florida, they have one of the more restrictive regimes for what it takes to selling a hearing aid. You have to have a multitude of government-mandated tests before you're allowed to sell a consumer a hearing aid. And what he was finding is the newer generation of hearing aids, the ones that work with your smartphones, the ones that can be calibrated using a personal computer, just didn't require these tests. You know, maybe back 20, 30 years ago, you got a hearing aid, you sat in a booth with an audiologist, they did this tone test. For most people, none of that is necessary any longer. And he thought, this is crazy. I'm putting all of my consumers, all my customers through these tests that are unnecessary. I don't want to do that anymore. I don't think I need this government license. And he was bolstered in that by reading articles about what the federal government has been doing in the area of occupational licensing for hearing aids. Hearing aids are regulated not only by states, but by the FDA. And the FDA over the years has realized that, requiring you to see a doctor before you get a hearing aid, requiring you to get a prescription for a hearing aid, mandating some of these tests that are antiquated and outdated, all it does is raise costs. So the federal government has said none of it's necessary.
And it's interesting because, a hearing aid is a product for one individual. They are the most interested party with respect to making sure that it works. They're the only ones who are going to bear the costs if it doesn't work or works too well or damages their hearing further. It doesn't seem there is the argument for letting people make that choice as easily as possible and letting them deal with whoever they want to deal with seems pretty natural.
Absolutely. And that's what consumers were saying to Dan, Dan Taylor. They would come to a store. He would invite them to sit down for a few minutes and get a kind of cursory test, see if they were eligible for hearing aids, see if they might benefit from one. The customers were coming to him, before they were seeing their doctor, saying, I don't see why I need to see a doctor. I can see this is helping me. Or maybe he would offer them a lower cost product that they could get at other hearing aid stores. So, Dan looked at this situation and said, this is crazy. I'm giving all these tests that are unnecessary just because the law requires it. He read online that the FDA was deregulating and was trying to encourage less burdens for the selling of a hearing aid. And he said, I don't think I need this license under federal law. I'm just going to give it up. He gave up his license about a year and a half ago, kept selling hearing aids. And as you might expect, that drew a cease and desist letter, a threat from the Florida state government that said, if you continue selling hearing aids, we're going to put you in jail and we're going to fine you. In order to get out of that, he paid a fine of $1,000. He stopped the illegal activity under Florida law. He came to Pacific Legal Foundation, and we promptly sued the state of Florida in federal court saying, your hearing aid licensing regime is illegal and unconstitutional.
So is it because the federal government already has a set of regulations, or was the fact that the federal government regulates hearing aids just guidance for taking action at the state level?
The case is built around two things. First, as you say, there is this federal regulation, and the FDA has been very clear that federal regulation is intended to preempt and invalidate state regulation that is contrary to it. And what they say, what the federal law says, is that states might be able to regulate hearing aids in some way, or the sales of them in some way, against fraud perhaps, but they can't regulate in ways that are more burdensome or in addition to the federal regulation, which is very light. It basically says you need to check somebody's ear to make sure they don't have an obvious health problem. And if they do, you should recommend they see a doctor before you sell them a hearing aid. But otherwise, you're free to sell them a hearing aid. So the case is built around this idea that the state regulation that puts all these burdens, unnecessary tests on hearing aid sellers, requires a license before you can sell a hearing aid. It's all preempted by federal law, and it has to be struck down. The second theory is a bigger constitutional theory, which is that you have a due process right under the federal Constitution to earn a living free of unnecessary government interference. And here we have a state that's erected this burdensome process for getting a license. You have to have months of apprenticeship. You have to pay thousands of dollars. You have to have continuing education. You have to conduct tests that the current science and the current state of technology has rendered antiquated or inadequate or unnecessary. You have to do all these things just to be able to sell a hearing aid to a consumer who wants to buy one. Those burdens deprive you of a right to earn an honest living free of needless government interference. That's unconstitutional under the 14th Amendment, and that's the second part of our challenge.
Other than the regulatory imposition that it is, it's got to raise costs for individuals who want hearing aids, and it's got to limit the scope of the market of people who would like to sell them.
It raises costs, and in 2015, I think again in 2016, the Federal Trade Commission, separately from the FDA, and the United States Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, both studied hearing aids and said requiring people to go to a doctor to get a prescription before getting a hearing aid, requiring people to go through audiological testing before getting a hearing aid, it may be nice in some circumstances, but it's not necessary because there's no harms that come to people from the modern type of hearing aid technology that people are using and buying and selling. It shouldn't be required under the law, and so we should strip these requirements out of the law in order to make hearing aids both lower cost and more accessible to more people. That's a very good federal policy. I mean, it's a rare circumstance in which the federal government, at least, is trying to deregulate and reduce costs and make hearing aids more accessible.
So what are the other implications here? I mean, if the FDA regulation, there are other federal agencies that regulate, obviously. And what are the implications for invalidating state laws that where the regulation is more burdensome at the state level?
Well, there are. I mean, in any situation in which the federal government is trying to do the right thing, trying to open markets up, trying to reduce barriers to competition, trying to eliminate laws that are more about protecting incumbents in the industry, more about protecting existing providers or sellers of hearing aids or other products and services than protecting public health and safety. I mean, it's great if the federal government recognizes that that's a problem and wants to enact federal regulation that eliminates those burdens or protectionist regulations. So, perhaps winning on what are called preemption grounds, the idea that federal law can preempt state law in certain areas, hopefully they could have a salutary effect or a good effect in other areas. The constitutional issue, I think, is more exciting, which is it's part of this larger conversation that we see in the culture about the validity and purposes, the efficacy of occupational licensing. And our theory is that even if there was a justification, say in the 1970s when these hearing aid seller regulations came into place, the devices back then were not the state of the art that they are today. They were harder to use. They were harder to calibrate. They required maintenance. Maybe there was some justification then for requiring licensing of sellers of that product that was very expensive and needed a lot of technical skills. In an era in which, you can calibrate them with a smartphone and firmware built right into the device that sticks in your ear, the circumstances have changed. And our theory is that when reality changes in the world out there because of technology, regulations, the government has an obligation to adapt to that, and regulations should change. And that can have enormous implications. If we win on that theory, there are untold number of occupational licensing restrictions or regulations of products and services that ought to be reconsidered because the facts that gave rise to the need for those regulations in the past no longer exist today. When circumstances change, the government has an obligation constitutionally to look at reality and respond to those changes. And that's, a cutting-edge constitutional theory that we're bringing to this case.
Where does the case stand right now?
In April, we filed a complaint in federal court in Orlando against the Florida Board of Hearing Aid Specialists. And in early July, we're filing a preliminary injunction motion. So what we're asking the court to do is, instead of waiting for a year or 2 years for this case to finally be decided, we want you to look at this preemption issue right now and say that the government basically has no case and you need to let Dan Taylor go back to work selling hearing aids as he wants to do to consumers who want to buy them. We'd like to get some resolution of the case very early. So we're filing a preliminary injunction motion, and that's probably going to be argued sometime in maybe August or early September of this year.
Larry Salzman is a senior attorney at the Pacific Legal Foundation. We spoke this weekend at FeeCon in Atlanta. Subscribe to and rate the Cato Daily Podcast at iTunes and Google Play, and follow us on Twitter at Cato Podcast.
Today we decided to walk to school. The light counted. 15, 14,
41, 31, 13. We
took a left on Carroll Street. Danny's smart, but he gets distracted.
I
realized he forgot his homework. I hope he doesn't have another bad day at school.
When you can see learning and attention issues from their side, you can be on their side. That's why there's Understood.org, a free resource for the parents of the 1 in 5 kids with learning and attention issues. Go from misunderstanding to Understood.org. Brought to you by Understood and the Ad Council.
Early to bed, early to rise makes a man healthy, wealthy, and wise.
And all was Benjamin Franklin wise.
So you actually think electricity can pass through metal? Ha! Ben Franklin, go fly a kite.
Excellent idea. Where are my keys?
Besides the bifocals, Ben invented the Franklin stove, the odometer, and the lightning rod. Ingenuity, pass it on. From the Foundation for a Better Life at values.com.